In this video, you will see several examples of how to fight with the rook against the knight and the bishop. Our journey begins with king and rook versus king and knight. Most of the time, this will lead to a drawish position. Of course, it depends if there are any pawns left on the board. The only way how you can fight for victory is if your enemy's knight is standing at the end of the board. For instance, on the edges, such as h1, h8, a1, and a8, and also the squares in front of them. So b7, b2, g2, and g7. Those are the squares where the knights feel the most uncomfortable and have the least amount of squares to go from. So, how should we fight against it? Now, as we can see, the knight is standing on g7. It is important to restrict the knight's mobility. That's why white starts with rook e1. This knight cannot go on e6 or e8. Also, f5 and h5 squares are covered by the king. So after rook e1, black plays king g8 because the knight cannot move. And now white plays a strong move, king to h6. King g6 looks way more logical, but it leads to a draw after king f8 because it allows black to play knight e8. And as we discussed, the knight has to be at the edge of the board, otherwise weaker side can hold a draw. So after playing king h6, black responds with knight f5, because it looks like the knight sort of escapes from this action. But it's not as easy as it looks like. After playing king h6, you might be wondering what happens in case of king f7, because it looks like a very logical option. The best move for white is rook f1. The king has to go back to g8, because there is really no other real way. And white plays with rook g1. The king can't go on the f-file because the knight will be gone. The only shot what they have got is to try to use the stalemate as an idea. But now white goes with king to g6. Luckily, black cannot even move the knight away anywhere, so white wins the game. So in case of king going to g8, now white has already king f6. King h8 is already a must, but white has king f7 followed by rook h1 and easily wins the game. And if we end up in the situation after king g6, black responds with knight e8, trying to escape from any action, there is rook e1. The knight goes on d6, there is already rook a1, and it is impossible to survive at this point. I know we went a little bit far in this section. So after king h6, most likely we'll be seeing knight f5 here. King g6. And now the knight has to go far away from it. Knight d6 will be a mistake trying to cover up e8 because of rook e6, and it's impossible to protect both. If black tries to go back on g7, unlike in the previous position, now white has already rook e7. When the king is on h6, there is knight f5, but now it's not anymore here. Only shot what black has got is just to try to use the stalemate idea, but there is rook a7 followed by rook a8, and of course white wins the game. So obviously black tries to escape with the knight by playing knight f5, followed by knight h4, and go as far away as possible. King f6. Now this knight is stuck. Plus, on top of that, the king can't go along the h-file to support the knight because there is rook h1. Also, king f8 is not a move because of rook h1. So knight pretty much has to go to f3. And now white plays rook d1. Surprisingly, this knight easily gets stuck, and the king and rook together can trap the knight. Therefore, if you'll be playing from the weaker side, please pay attention to the detail and always try to keep the knight closer to your king. Otherwise, the knight will be gone very easily. So black goes with knight h2, rook goes to g1, king f8, and king goes to e6. Very strong move. It prevents knight f3 because of rook f1. Otherwise, the king also cannot go on e8 because of rook g8. Surprisingly, after just 8 moves, black resigns because this knight was horribly placed on g7 square. Let's have a look at more practical position. Is white winning in this situation, or it should be a draw? It is very common that knight tries to create these kind of fortresses, especially there are like only 1 or 2 pawns left on the board. The probability of having a drawish position at the end of the line increases if you have less amount of pawns. Right here, white goes with rook b8, knight to g3, and king d6. The only weakness what black has got in their camp is the f7 pawn, so white obviously tries to hunt onto that. Otherwise, there is just impossible to do anything else. Black just moves the knight back and forth all day long, and there's not a single thing what white can do about it. So rook b8. King h7 would be a big mistake because it welcomes the king on f6, which is clearly not something what black wants to allow. So knight goes to g3 and king d6. White tries to bring the king on e7 square and somehow attack the f7 pawn. If this happens, followed by rook f8, of course, white will be happy with the outcome. So knight goes back to f5. In case of knight h5, which looks also a logical option, there is rook b4, overprotecting the pawn. If black allows white to bring the king on e7 and e8, this already will be easily winning. So in case of king f8, king d7, and sooner rather than later this is happening, followed by rook b7, and of course black will be lost in short order. So right here after king d6, knight f5 was played, king goes to d7 with the same intention what we discussed earlier, and black goes with king h7. This was actually a big mistake. It was possible to play here knight g3 and trying to hold on to that draw there, but of course it's not as easy as it looks like. We saw after king e8 there's rook b7 and black can resign in short order. So right here after king d7, black could try to play knight h4 perhaps or knight g3, but they played king h7, which is a huge mistake. It allows white to play king e8, attacking the pawn, and after king g8 plays rook d8. Black is stuck. Rook d7 is a real threat, followed by rook f7. One option is to go with king g7, but it's a very painful move playing rook d3 right now. The knight has nowhere else to go. In case of knight h4, there already will be rook d7 followed by rook f7. Otherwise, of course, rook d7 again will be happening on the next move, and black easily loses the game. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the like button, because whenever we reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway video courses from my website. Rook versus bishop. These positions are much easier and will lead to a drawish position without a lot of fight, unlike when we have the king and knight versus king and rook. So right now it is impossible to keep this bishop stuck somewhere with our king and rook, because bishop has a lot of squares to go. Especially if it comes to both pieces being centralized, king and bishop, it's impossible to push for a win. So you can try something like rook a7, and black responds with king d7, let's say king goes to d5. How to play these kind of positions? Please make sure that you don't move the bishop all the way to b8 and bring king on d8 and trying to sort of survive into this situation, because you're sort of helping your opponent to improve the position even more. It's definitely not recommended, but you can move the bishop on g3. So if you look at it the way that the king and rook versus king, in order to deliver checkmate, at some point the kings needs to be standing in front of each other, making opposition, and then playing rook a7 to force the king to go on the back rank, right? But you just keep this bishop along this diagonal and you just stay around like king f7, king e7. So you're not allowing white's king to stand on e5 square. And as long as this is not really possible and white just goes for something like that, maybe king e4, king of bishop g3, king f5. But again, any kind of check will be happening, you're simply centralizing the king. So just keep the bishop on that area and simply go back and forth. There is nothing what can be happening, of course. Just be cautious if the rook attacks your bishop somewhere in the bullet or blitz games. Just pay attention to not do two automatic moves. Protect it, and it will be very easy draw for you. Let's have a look at more practical example. King and rook versus bishop and pawn. Well, the only way how white can win this game is by capturing the pawn on f4. Otherwise, it's impossible. Checkmate is not really happening right here. So in order to achieve that, it is important to attack the pawn properly. So you want to move the king on e5 at some point, rook b4 and rook f4. But you can't try with king d5 immediately, because when the king goes there, let's say you just try to grab the pawn instantly, it's not going to help you, because black plays king f6 and the pawn ending will lead to a drawish position. That's why white has to be careful and needs to do all these very well. Rook f7, king e8, and rook goes to f5. So what white wants to achieve is this king being very far away from any action whenever white goes with king e5 followed by rook takes f4. Black responds with bishop d2. In case of king d8, this is considered as a big mistake, because after rook f8, king c7, now white can actually go for king e5 followed by rook f4, and black's king will be very far away from f6 square. So in case of king d7, there is rook f4, takes, and black's king has to be on f6, which is not really enough time, so we go with king g5 and white is easily winning. Therefore, black here sort of stays and plays bishop d2, because he understands that the king has to be too close to the f pawn. But white had this brilliant move king f6. King has to go on f8. Otherwise, if white will have enough time to go king g5 and then grabbing it, nothing good is going to happen. King f8 and rook goes to c5. Threatening mate in one move. So black goes with king g8, check, and king comes here. King goes to f7. Probably you're wondering, why is it that complicated to play all this move sequence? Why can't we go this king f5, rook c4? But it just doesn't work that way, because black knows the moment you take on f4, the king ends up on f6. So we go with king f7, threatening rook c2, followed by rook h2. Of course, king comes up, rook goes to g8, and the best thing what actually happened is because the king went along the h file we forced it, now the king is cut, which will never get to the g file, and white easily grabs the pawn on f4 with a winning pawn endgame. If you want to see more content about the chance endings, you definitely need to check out this playlist, which includes a lot of interesting endgame positions.